The agricultural world in which people had lived for hundreds of years was replaced by a dynamic urban industrial society. The products of the Industrial Revolution flowed to busy markets in London and in all the major cities of Europe. This expanding trade gave new power to the rising middle classes, to merchants, manufacturers, and professionals. In the changing economy, the Jews of Western Europe found new opportunities. They were literate, and many had experience in trade. Some became manufacturers of clothing or textiles. Some became merchants. A few became bankers. At the beginning of the 19th century, Mayer Amschel Rothschild of Frankfurt am Main was a financial advisor to the ruler of one of the many German states. In 1805, Rothschild's eldest son, Nathan, went to London, where he made his fortune as a stockbroker and banker. His four brothers established branches of the family bank in Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Berlin. Within 20 years, they became one of the most powerful banking families in Europe. The Rothschilds were a dramatic symbol of Jewish success in the modern world. For Jews like the Rothschilds, social acceptance was possible. But for the majority of Jews, legal restrictions and ancient prejudice were still barriers to social equality. In most places, Jews were excluded from government, excluded from posts in universities. They needed permits even to reside in certain cities, such as Berlin. In the 1820s, many prominent German Jews converted to Christianity. Among them, the poet Heinrich Heine.
The baptismal certificate is the ticket of admission to European culture. Berlin is well worth a sermon.
For most Jews, however, the idea of baptism was unacceptable. They wanted to join in the non-Jewish world without abandoning their Jewish identity. But many traditional Jewish customs and practices reinforced their separateness. By the 1820s in Germany, some Jewish reformers were questioning the validity of these practices.
We can no longer adhere blindly to forms and prescriptions from a time long past and forever vanished. We can no longer observe commands which have no spiritual hold on us.
The Reform movement established its own congregations. Here in the West London synagogue, Reform Jews appeared as English as any other Englishman. Organ music and a choir were introduced into the Jewish service. The Reformers sought to create a modern expression of Jewish values and beliefs. We are not a separate people, said the Reformers. We are Europeans, different from others only in our religion. A German rabbi, Samson Raphael Hirsch, disagreed.
Judaism is not a religion. The synagogue is not a church, and the rabbi is not a priest. Judaism is not a mere adjunct to life. To be a Jew is the sum total of our task in life.
Most Jews did indeed hold to the traditional ways, but gradually they accepted those changes that seemed natural and inevitable in a changing world. The unity of Jewish religious practice had been shattered. It could never be restored. The Central European city of Prague still reflects the character of traditional Europe, a world of inherited privilege for the few and of poverty and powerlessness for most others. As the early decades of the 19th century unfolded, this traditional world was being undermined by the forces of a changing economy. The growing middle classes were demanding the political rights first promised in the French Revolution. They were demanding democracy. 1848. Guards fired on a political demonstration in Paris. The people rioted. They barricaded the streets and fought back the army. Spontaneous revolts flared in Italy, Austria, Denmark, Hungary, Germany. Everywhere Jews joined in the struggle for liberty. A rabbi of Vienna declared,
"We ask nothing for ourselves, everything for the nation and the fatherland. First, the right of all men to live, to breathe, to think, to speak. First, the rights of all citizens. Afterwards, our rights as Jews."
In Frankfurt and elsewhere throughout Europe, hastily gathered assemblies created liberal constitutions and granted political equality to Jews and other religious minorities. But the new governments were disorganized and inexperienced. They were quickly overthrown as conservative rulers everywhere reasserted their authority. It is true in one sense that the revolutions failed, but in another sense they succeeded. All of Europe had glimpsed a vision of a more democratic society. A vision that could not be ignored, even by the most powerful of monarchs. In Vienna, the failure of the revolution of 1848 was followed by the accession to the imperial throne of the youthful Franz Joseph. He ruled here in the Hofburg Palace for 68 years, while the foundations of his Austro-Hungarian Empire were being undermined by the diverse national aspirations of his many subject peoples. The idea that political boundaries ought to encompass a people with a common language and culture, the idea of the nation-state, had sprung from the French Revolution, together with the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. After 1848, Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, Italians, and Germans all clamored for independence, for their own nation-states, in which every citizen could participate fully in government and politics. Nowhere was the struggle for political equality as far advanced as in Great Britain. Jews and other minorities were in most respects full equals of the Protestant majority. But here in the House of Commons, every new member of Parliament was required to take an oath on the true faith of a Christian. This oath excluded Jews from the highest levels of government. In 1847, Lionel Rothschild was elected to the House of Commons. He presented himself at Parliament, but refused to take the oath. He was obliged to withdraw. Rothschild's supporters introduced a bill to remove the barrier of the oath. The Anglican Church was swift to respond.
If you destroy the groundwork of Christianity upon which this legislature is based, in order to gratify a handful of ambitious men, you will destroy Christian England.
Others disagreed. England, they said, was not an exclusively Christian nation.
What is proposed is not that Jews should legislate for a Christian community, but that a legislature composed of Christians and Jews should legislate for a community of Christians and Jews.
The debate continued for 11 years. In 1858, after having been elected 6 times, Lionel Rothschild was finally admitted to the House of Commons. He placed his hand on the Old Testament and took his oath as a member of Parliament. The last major obstacle to Jewish participation in the political life of Britain had been removed. Among the members of Parliament who had supported Lionel Rothschild was the son of an Italian Jewish immigrant. His name was Benjamin Disraeli. He had converted to Christianity, yet in the eyes of his colleagues, he remained a Jew. 10 years after Rothschild's victory, Disraeli became Prime Minister of Great Britain. His rise to power was evidence of a growing acceptance of Jews in the social and political life of Europe. The liberal cause was making steady progress across the continent. New nation-states were established with liberal constitutions, and country after country granted political emancipation to the Jews. But emancipation ended at the frontier of Russia. Beyond that frontier, more than 50% of all the Jews in the world lived under Russian rule. The vast Russian Empire lay 1,000 miles to the east of France and England. It was a land as incomprehensible to most Western Europeans as it was remote. Its customs were medieval, its society autocratic, all but untouched by the forces that were shaking Western Europe. The Russian world was heir to the spiritual values of the Byzantine Empire and the Eastern Orthodox faith. At the end of the 18th century, Russia annexed large parts of Poland, Lithuania, and the Ukraine. With this expansion, Russia brought under its rule most of the great Jewish community of Poland. For centuries, Russia had excluded all Jews. Now it found within its borders a Jewish population of more than 1 million. A community of artisans and tradesmen, of innkeepers and merchants. Russian merchants, alarmed at the prospect of competition from these Jews, demanded protection. The government responded. It drew a line around the provinces where the Jews already lived and forbade them to leave this territory. The region was called the Pale of Settlement. Everywhere within the great expanse of the Pale, Jews were a minority, living in the lands of other peoples, living among the peasants of the Ukraine or of Poland, of Lithuania or of Moldavia. Christians and Jews lived side by side, depending upon each other in a rural economy centered on the local market town called in Yiddish the shtetl. Jews were the merchants in this agricultural economy.
The peasants come from many miles around, bringing their livestock and vegetables, their fish and hides, their wagon loads of grain. In exchange, they buy the city produce which the Jews import, dry goods, boots, oil, and spades.
Although Jews and their peasant neighbors mingled in the marketplace and in the streets of town, They were separated by culture, language, and religion. Jews had their own local governments, their own courts and schools, and their own charitable institutions to care for the poor. The rhythms of Jewish life were the rhythms of the religious calendar, of the Sabbath, the festivals, and the holy days. A German Jew admired the pious integrity of their lives.
A book is their fatherland. They live enclosed within the boundaries of this book. Here they exercise their inalienable right of citizenship. Here they can be neither expelled nor despised.
The Hasidic Jews of today inherit a legacy of dress, of belief, of custom and tradition from their Eastern European past. Among the most respected Jewish communal institutions of Eastern Europe was the yeshiva, the advanced academy of religious education. The great yeshivas of the Pale were famous for their scholarship among Jews everywhere. Families made great sacrifices so that their sons might devote themselves entirely to the study of the sacred texts, the Torah and the Talmud. For all men, study was the means by which Jewish law could be understood and applied to daily life.
A man who puts out his hand to beg does so because he is poor. Unfortunately, in our times, the poor are forced to put out their hands. The rich man doesn't take his hand from his pocket to give to the poor. The poor man must beg first. Isn't this true?
A preoccupation with ethical values infused Jewish culture with a keen moral awareness that gave the Jewish community its particular caste and flavor. The dispute and argument of Talmudic study was the discipline by which they lived. This distinctive culture was deeply alien to the Russian world. The Russian government wanted the Jews to abandon their study of Torah and Talmud, to abandon their separateness. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Jews of Eastern Europe would come face to face with the autocratic power of the Russian state. The Tsar of Russia, the Emperor, was absolute in his authority. His will was law. The Tsars sought to modernize their economy, to force all the peoples of the empire to serve the interests of the state. Under Nicholas I, Jewish children as young as 12 were drafted into the army to serve for 25 years. Whole communities were forcibly relocated. When Nicholas died in 1855, it is said that there was such rejoicing that people embraced each other in the streets of St. Petersburg. Nicholas was succeeded by his son, Alexander II. Like his predecessors, Alexander wanted to transform Russian society. He too became an autocratic ruler, but he was a man of more generous spirit. He freed the 30 million Russians who were bound to the land as serfs. He encouraged modern industry and brought a measure of civil liberty to his people. Alexander's policies accelerated the changes in Russian society. To stimulate commerce, he allowed a few thousand of the most successful Jewish businessmen and professionals to leave the Pale and settle anywhere in the empire. Their children were able to enter the great universities in Moscow and St. Petersburg.
When we came out of the university, we bowed before the sanctuary that had opened its doors to us. We embraced each other. Proudly, we walked home, eager to shout to everyone we met, "Have you heard? We are students."
These Jewish students learned Russian instead of Hebrew, science, mathematics, and literature instead of Torah and Talmud. They brought the Jewish passion for study with them as they entered the modern world and left the traditional world behind. While Russian society changed, the Russian government did not. The people remained powerless. Economic modernization disrupted their lives. The old network of rural commerce was destroyed. Thousands left the villages and farms and headed for the cities. Many lost their occupations and were forced to wander in search of employment. In 1881, Alexander II was assassinated by anarchists. Rumors spread that the Jews were responsible. A few weeks later, in the city of Elisabethgrad, a riot broke out among peasants and workers. They attacked the Jews while the police looked on. By the end of 1881, the riots had spread to more than 200 towns and villages.
The air resounded with wild shouts. The destruction began. Clouds of feathers whirled in the air, the din of breaking windows, the crying, shouting, and despair.
Pogrom. It was the Russian word for riot. In the decades that followed, pogroms would break out again and again, with terrifying consequences. The Russian government would begin to use pogroms as a tool of policy, to turn the anger of the populace away from the state and toward the Jews. It was a crushing blow for all Jews, including those who had entered into Russian life.
Until now, we thought of ourselves as Russians, not as Jews. The events of these last weeks have shown us how tragic has been our mistake. Yes, we are Jews.
Many looked for other lands in which they could settle. Tens of thousands fled the Pale in 1881, turning their eyes toward new worlds. A few young enthusiasts headed for the ancient Jewish homeland, Palestine. But the vast majority of those who left Eastern Europe headed west, through the great ports of Germany, through Bremen and Hamburg, bound for America. In the 40 years following 1881, about 2 million Jews, a third of the Jews in Eastern Europe, would pass through these halls, clinging to their few belongings, headed toward what they hoped would be a better life.
The news was all over Polotsk that my mother had a steamer ticket for America. Everyone wanted to handle the ticket. How much did it cost? Was it sure that we could get kosher food on the ship? Oh, she must take all the feather beds.
Some became merchants. A few became bankers. At the beginning of the 19th century, Mayer Amschel Rothschild of Frankfurt am Main was a financial advisor to the ruler of one of the many German states. In 1805, Rothschild's eldest son, Nathan, went to London, where he made his fortune as a stockbroker and banker. His four brothers established branches of the family bank in Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Berlin. Within 20 years, they became one of the most powerful banking families in Europe. The Rothschilds were a dramatic symbol of Jewish success in the modern world. For Jews like the Rothschilds, social acceptance was possible. But for the majority of Jews, legal restrictions and ancient prejudice were still barriers to social equality. In most places, Jews were excluded from government, excluded from posts in universities. They needed permits even to reside in certain cities, such as Berlin. In the 1820s, many prominent German Jews converted to Christianity. Among them, the poet Heinrich Heine.
The baptismal certificate is the ticket of admission to Europe.
The agricultural world in which people had lived for hundreds of years was replaced by a dynamic urban industrial society. The products of the Industrial Revolution flowed to busy markets in London and in all the major cities of Europe. This expanding trade gave new power to the rising middle classes, to merchants, manufacturers, and professionals. In the changing economy, the Jews of Western Europe found new opportunities. They were literate, and many had experience in trade. Some became manufacturers of clothing or textiles.
European culture. Berlin is well worth a sermon.
For most Jews, however, the idea of baptism was unacceptable. They wanted to join in the non-Jewish world without abandoning their Jewish identity. But many traditional Jewish customs and practices reinforced their separateness. By the 1820s in Germany, some Jewish reformers were questioning the validity of these practices.
We can no longer adhere blindly to forms and prescriptions from a time long past and forever vanished. We can no longer observe commands which have no spiritual hold on us.
The Reform movement established its own congregations. Here in the West London Synagogue, Reform Jews appeared as English as any other Englishman. Organ music and a choir were introduced into the Jewish service. The reformers sought to create a modern expression